Hi, welcome. My name is Barth. I'm a rising senior poli-sci major at Middlebury College. This is the second episode in the MIDDVantage Career on Capitol Hill series. In the previous episode, it was Matthew Dickinson giving an overview of Congress. Today, we're going to be focusing on appropriations, and we have with us today Anna Esten, class of 2013, poli-sci major and econ minor. She first went to Capitol Hill to work for former Representative Allison Schwartz as a legislative correspondent and scheduler, before moving over to Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island's office as a legislative correspondent, later a legislative assistant, and then finally as a senior health policy advisor. She now works in the Boston greater area hospital system as a government community affairs specialist. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, can you just tell me a little bit about your career path and what led you on that decision-making process?
Absolutely. Well, I think for me, it was pretty clear cut, actually. I've always been a political junkie since I was a very young age. So when I got to Middlebury, it was very easy for me to choose my political science major. I focused a lot on American politics in the courses that I took and the various things that I studied throughout the course of my major. And it was always a goal of mine to get to Capitol Hill. And so looked for a lot of jobs after graduating and was lucky enough to land in Congresswoman Schwartz's office. But I think a really important part of my career trajectory was what I learned through the internships that I did while I was a student at Middlebury. So I actually interned in my congressman from Pennsylvania's district office. I interned for a nonprofit organization that worked on reproductive health issues. I interned in the U.S. Senate in D.C. while I spent a semester there, and I also interned in the White House in the First Lady's office. And so those experiences all really informed my decision to both want to go to D.C., to go into policy, and to go to Capitol Hill, where the legislative process happens in real time. So learned a lot from those experiences and was really grateful for how Middlebury prepared me to take those on. And then, started at the bottom rung on Capitol Hill and worked my way up to working on health policy in a senator's office.
Wow, that's quite the process. So to get into things, can you explain a little bit about what appropriations is and the difference between the overall budget and specifically appropriations?
Absolutely. So the appropriations process is a really fascinating and really integral part of all of the work that happens on Capitol Hill, because appropriations is how things get funded. So you can pass laws and you can direct agencies to do things as Congress, but it's often really challenging to get those things done unless the money follows that. So appropriations is really the way things actually get executed and the way policy gets formed. And when we think about how the executive branch is executing the laws, a lot of that comes down to whether they have the money to do it. So the appropriations process actually begins with a budget. So early in the year, usually in February, although that timeline has slipped in many years, the president actually submits a budget proposal to Congress and says, as the president, here is what I recommend be spent on all the various different agencies and programs that comprise the federal government. The Congress then takes that document and makes its own budget, basically. In recent years, especially, the president's budget document has really become more of a messaging document than an actual framework for starting the budget, especially in a time of divided government with a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, I had that backwards, Democratic House and Republican Senate. They really have to negotiate with each other to get any appropriations done. And so the policies of the president are somewhat irrelevant to the way that negotiation begins. But traditionally, Congress will then work on a budget resolution to set the top line numbers for what different agencies can spend. And then they use those top line numbers to assign the appropriations committees and the appropriations subcommittees what they can spend. And so there are 12 appropriations subcommittees. And so they are divided into various topics. From my experience, I worked primarily with the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Related Agencies subcommittee. So often many different topics are combined, some related, some not related, into one. appropriations bill. And so each of the subcommittees is then tasked with coming up with both the dollar amounts for different agencies, different programs, as well as what's called report language. So there's the actual legislation that has the dollar amounts in it. And then there's associated report language, which gives the agencies more specifics in terms of how they can spend that money, or often how they can't spend that money. Technically, report language is non-binding, but the executive branch typically complies as much as possible with what's in the report language. So that's a very quick overview, but it's a very big process, takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And one important thing to note about the appropriations process and the budget process is that they're governed by various rules in Congress. But one thing to know about Congress is that if it's a rule Congress made, it's a rule Congress can break. And so you'll hear, people talking about budget points of order and things like that. But ultimately, the bodies in Congress can vote to waive those points of order. And so the rules only exist to the extent the votes are there to support those rules, which I think creates sort of an interesting dynamic in the budget and appropriations process.
It does seem that there are all these deadlines for the budget process. The president introduces at the beginning of February, it needs to be passed by September 30th, but they're frequently not followed. Do you know why it is that it seems increasingly that the budget is always delayed?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the partisanship and the polarization that we're facing that you heard about in the first episode of this series with Professor Dickinson. I think that the partisanship around everything is heightened these days, but when it comes to appropriations, those are hugely important decisions that Congress makes in terms of where the funding is going. And, your budget is your priorities. And so when you're talking about where dollars are gonna show up in communities, for constituents, it's really important, and everybody wants to make sure they get the biggest piece of the pie they can possibly get for their priorities.
Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like to be a staffer on a bill and being involved in the appropriation process and allocating those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to note that basically what this sounds like is, okay, you've got a bunch of numbers, people have to decide on what the numbers are going to be, they probably go into a room and hash it out, and that certainly does happen to some extent, but there's actually a long process leading into that requires a lot of staff work. So from the staff perspective, we actually describe it as approps season, so it's sort of like fall, winter, spring, appropes. And it's because approps takes up so much of our time and energy as Hill staffers. So the first thing that happens is a ton of different meetings. In the time frame after the president's budget comes out and before appropriations deadlines start to hit, many different interest groups will make it a point to come down to Capitol Hill or visit their representatives in their home offices in their states and districts and make their case for what their priority is. And that's true of individuals as well who, feel strongly about certain programs. So as a healthcare staffer, I primarily met with groups of healthcare providers, medical researchers, advocates for different disease groups that want to see, more funding at the NIH for a certain disease. And they would all come down to the Hill and have meetings either with staff or with the senator or representative to sort of make their case. And, I was privileged to be a Senate staffer focused almost primarily on healthcare. On the House side, staffers are more likely to be covering a number of issues and therefore taking meetings on healthcare, education, the Postal Service, a variety of different things, and keeping track of all of those requests. And so the information that we gather in those meetings, in addition to, information we've gathered throughout our time, informs the different requests that each member makes to the Appropriations Committee. So after we would take in all that information, I would work with my boss and my colleagues to develop those requests. And those happen in two tracks. Each senator or representative makes their personal request to each subcommittee. So they say, I am Senator Smith and I am requesting funding at these levels for these 10 programs. These are my biggest priorities. You list them in priority order, all these different things. And then there are also sign-on letters, and those are letters that are led by a single senator or a small group of senators, but they invite, sorry, I'm talking about the Senate, but I also mean in the House as well, the same things happen, led by a rep or a group of reps. And those, they invite other members of Congress to sign on to those to show broad support for an issue. So for example, one of the most bipartisan appropriations items each year is funding for the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. That letter gets, I want to say, upwards of 70 signatures in the House, in the Senate, and hundreds in the House. And so that shows really broad bipartisan support. On the other hand, there are certain programs that, really only affect a certain number of districts and states. And so they may get a smaller number of sign-ons, but, are still very important for those areas. And so we work on those for a long time. We submit those letters, we shop those around to other offices to try to get as much support as possible. But I think the thing to note is that appropriations takes up a lot of staff time and energy. The senior staff are working directly with the member to develop an overall strategy across all 12 different subcommittees. The legislative staff are, doing research and developing these requests to make sure they are meeting the needs of the constituents and the priorities of the member. And the junior staff are also working really hard to help track these requests, help support meeting preparation, get people to sign on and make sure things are submitted correctly, which is extremely important. And so, it's really an all hands on deck effort. And, I think it shows in the fact that, it's a lot of money and it all gets doled out usually on time, although these days not as often. But it's really important that everybody engages because it is such a robust process.
So I'm wondering how much of the total budget is actually being debated here? Like, how much is mandatory and discretionary? Can you explain a little bit about those? And then do you have an estimate on the total amount of money that usually goes through the appropriation process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it's something that can often get lost in this conversation is that when you think about the budget, when you think about your own personal budget, it's all of the money you have available and all of the money you spend. But that's not really how the federal appropriations process works, because so much of the funding is, quote, mandatory funding. And that's funding that's determined by a formula and not by an appropriation. So I think the example programs that people are most familiar with in terms of mandatory funding is Social Security and Medicare. So those are paid out to all of the people who qualify, healthcare coverage for all the people who qualify. And there aren't really caps on how much spending there is. Congress could always amend those formulas, but they don't actually set out a dollar amount. They set out an expectation in terms of how the money will be spent. Discretionary funding, on the other hand, is what we're talking about is being debated by Congress in the appropriations process. And that represents actually only about 40% of federal spending. So the majority of federal dollars are going out through the mandatory process. But that's not to say that it's a small number. It's still, we're talking many, many billions of dollars. I imagine, I don't actually know off the top of my head, the entire size of the discretionary budget. I believe it's trillions, over $1 trillion, I want to say, is the number that's coming to my mind. But a lot of money is really the short answer.
So there are 12 subcommittees in both the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee.
That's correct.
And they each write up their own bill into 12 different sections. Yep. Are these passed individually? Are they passed together as a group? How is that process divided up?
That's a really good question. So when this process was originally designed, it was envisioned that there would be 12 pieces of legislation that passed individually. One important thing to note about appropriations is that the process is designed to originate in the House. So the House is supposed to go first on all spending legislation. And so that's typically where the process starts. But you're correct that the Senate often will pass its own bill, and then those bills will need to be reconciled. That has changed a bit recently, and you're seeing a lot more talk of omnibus bills, or even more recently, minibus bills. And that is describing the act of sort of combining a bunch of these 12 bills together into one bill. So an omnibus bill is supposed to represent passing all 12 appropriations bills at the same time. And then more recently, we've had some of these mini bus bills where Congress has opted to pass some of the bills that they have reached agreement on and continue to wait and try to work on bills where they haven't reached agreement. My favorite goofy Congress word that has come out recently is the cromnibus, which is meant to describe a bill that includes a number of appropriations bills as well as a continuing resolution. And we can get into that a little bit, but basically saying we haven't reached agreement, so please continue to fund this at the previous fiscal year's levels for a certain amount of time until we can figure something else out.
So these members on the 12 subcommittees and the general committee themselves, how much influence do certain members have, and how do they use this influence over the process to benefit themselves or their constituents?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Appropriations continues to be one of the most powerful committees in Congress on both sides, in both chambers. And I think that it's been interesting lately because one of the things you may have heard about in the past is earmarks. And earmarks are provisions that direct funding for specific projects or organizations, but earmarks were actually banned in Congress in 2011. So basically there's been an agreement that you can't specifically direct this funding to that level. You have to have different grant programs where people can apply. You can certainly set out parameters for those programs, but you can't specifically direct them to different organizations or districts, as has happened in the past. And so in the past, when there were earmarks, it was really a power position to be on the Appropriations Committee because you were in the room writing those laws where you could direct funding to your district, you know, whether it was a bridge that needed to be redone or an organization that needed grant funding to support a new community program. There was a lot more ability to actually directly fund things. And that ability has waned in recent years since the earmark ban. That being said, again, it's a congressional rule. And so congressional rules can be broken by Congress. And there continue to be, you know, different senators and representatives who are working to get earmarks reinstated because they think they don't have enough representation on the Appropriations Committee and are at a disadvantage if they're perhaps from a smaller state, and think that in an earmark situation, they could direct more funding to where they want to see it go. But obviously there is a drawback to that because if you fail to get the earmark for your district or your state, you don't really have an excuse because there is the creation of these grant programs where they're competitive does create a little bit of distance between Congress and the actual provision of funding that, you know, could be a little bit more safe politically. So I think there's really pros and cons to both situations. But still the Appropriations Committee is a really powerful place to be in terms of, you know, being there as these bills are getting developed. You know, every senator, every representative gets to weigh in, but, you know, it is a different level of power and influence to be in the room.
So you talk about how, especially back when earmarks were common, the Appropriations Committee members can specifically direct funding towards different programs and targets. I'm wondering what specificity of legislation happens in these bodies. Is it that they just tell the Department of Transportation, hey, you can have this much money? Or is it, hey, you can have this much money and you need to use it here and you need to use it with this tools and you need to use it, you need to buy at this specific place? How specific are these bills?
Yeah, it completely depends on the agency, the program, and honestly, the restraints that Congress wants to put on the agency. And so in the healthcare world, I think, again, I'm going back to my NIH example in part because, you know, it's many billions of dollars. And so the NIH is divided into 26 institutes and centers. So the NIH isn't even, you know, a department, it's within HHS. So we've got a sub-agency in the NIH. It's got all these sub-agencies underneath it. And so, you know, in the NIH example, the Congress both provides, you know, line items for each institute and center, but also can provide additional guidance in terms of what the priorities should be or specific, things that they want the Institute to focus on, even if they don't put a number on it, may say, the committee recognizes the efforts around pancreatic cancer research and encourages, the Institute to do XYZ. Now that's non-binding, but it is something that, the departments will look at as guidance in terms of how they prioritize their efforts. In other cases, folks get what seems like a blank check because they have, different objectives that they need to meet, and that, Congress doesn't feel like it's appropriate to weigh in, with more specificity on what the specifics should be. You wouldn't see, an inspector general's office get their money and say, and you must investigate XYZ things, because the purpose of the inspector general is to be sort of an independent body, which is not to say you couldn't see things like that, but traditionally we don't. And so it really does depend, Congress's comfort weighing in and their desire to weigh in and sort of get into the weeds of what the agencies are doing. And I think it really does depend on what the purpose is. And, again, Congress does have a little bit of distance, which can be nice to sort of give the executive branch some amount of independence to use their expertise to decide priorities. But at the same time, if Congress has something that's a priority to them that they want to make sure gets done, this is their opportunity to direct the agency to act in certain ways.
I'm wondering, how much influence do the staffers working on these bills have with specific programs that get, I don't know, $50 or $70 million? Does the staff member decide whether to write down $50 or $70 million? How do the details get sorted out? Is it the staff members, or is it like the representatives themselves focusing on the weeds here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think I will caveat this by saying that I never worked directly for the Appropriations Committee, so I don't fully know how the process looks like from the inside. I was a little bit outside of it as a personal office staffer, where, I was submitting my boss's requests and working with the committee to make sure those were communicated, understood, but I wasn't necessarily in the room where the numbers were getting written down. Although I will say that the appropriations committees have a lot of staff, and those staff, really drill down and become experts in the various areas for each subcommittee. And they're the ones who sort of hold all the cards and make a lot of decisions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, everything rests with the member, so the buck sort of stops with them, but the requests are, or the numbers on the page are largely put together by staff work. And an important thing to know about appropriations, which I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, is that everything is sort of compared to the previous fiscal year. So you think about appropriations in terms of increase over last year or decrease over last year or level funding over last year. And so it's not like they're starting from zero. They will typically go back at least 1 year, maybe 2-3 years, and see, what the trends are, what's that resulted in terms of executive branch action. Do we want to continue investing? Has this gone horribly wrong and we need to cut back the funding to make room for other priorities? And so it's not like, they have this giant number and they have to whittle it down. It's really a question of, what were our numbers last year? How much additional money do we have this year, if any? And where do we want to prioritize putting that? I think for members of Congress who are on the Appropriations Committee, I imagine this takes up a large amount of their time and energy, but I would bet that they're really only in the weeds on a handful of priorities that are extremely important to them, their states, their districts, and are, generally aware of the work that's happening in a wide variety of different areas as well.
So we know that there's obviously a lot of debate and a lot of dispute that goes on in this process. I was wondering if you could compare how the disputes are settled differently if it's happening within a party versus if it's happening between the two parties.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think when you're talking about negotiating appropriations bills, it's really important for parties to represent a united front when it comes to entering those negotiations and what some of the big priorities might be. And some of those are often driven by current events. So obviously we're coming up not too far from now on September 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. So October 1st is the beginning of the new fiscal year. And Congress has not really acted much on appropriations. And so I think in the next month or so, we're going to see a lot more chatter about the Postal Service and how much funding that should get than we would normally hear in, another year. And so sometimes those priorities are really driven by what's happening in the world. And obviously COVID is a really important part of everything that's happening right now. And that's really going to inform how the process goes. And you've already seen, the two parties sort of coalesce around different things. But, outside of the COVID example, I think, if we think about who each party is made up of, and I'm obviously more familiar with the Democratic Party from my experience, but it's pretty unlikely that Dianne Feinstein in California and Joe Manchin in West Virginia have the same top 3 budget priorities. It's just not going to happen. But that being said, Dianne Feinstein may not oppose Joe Manchin's budget priorities. They're just not at the top of her list. And so it does fall to individual senators and House members to sort of make sure they're advocating for the things that are really important to their district. But there are also a number of issues that, the parties are really in agreement on, and a number of issues that the parties are really not in agreement on, but everybody sort of picks and chooses their lanes in terms of what they're going to advocate for. And then in appropriations, it's interesting because there actually are a lot of things that are truly bipartisan. So I've talked about the National Institutes of Health a lot, but that program or that agency has gotten a $2 billion funding increase in each of the last handful of years, which is pretty unprecedented. And that's been supported across the aisle. At the same time, anything related to the Affordable Care Act is just the third rail in terms of healthcare spending. And so you do get these sort of places of agreement and places of disagreement. I think it's really up to the leadership in the party to sort of get their members in line in terms of what is going to be the fight that we're bringing to this appropriations negotiation. And it's, at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game. There is only so many dollars that are going to get appropriated. And so the parties do have to decide somewhat as a collective what they're going to budge on and what they absolutely will not budge on. And so creating that party cohesion, often falls with the speaker, the majority and minority leaders to make sure that their members are in line. And, when members fall out of line, for example, the 2013 shutdown with the ACA funding debacle, that's when you can run into some messy territory in terms of not funding the government.
Yeah, so if leadership isn't able to get their members in line, or the two parties can't resolve their disputes, or they do and the president doesn't agree, and then they end up breaking their own rule on the timeline, what happens then? What happens if the process goes wrong?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 versions of the process going wrong. And the first version is what I mentioned earlier, when Congress ends up doing a continuing resolution. A continuing resolution is, not a thing that gets reported on a lot. It's not interesting. And that's because basically what Congress has decided to do is coast. They are extending the previous year's funding levels for X amount of time. They usually put a deadline on themselves, usually of a few months, or the next time that they're going to have to pass big legislation if there's another deadline looming. And the reason that this doesn't get paid attention to as much is that it doesn't really affect people's daily lives. Checks don't stop showing up, and people don't get furloughed from their jobs, but it doesn't create the new investments that should come in a new budget year where ideally the amount of funding is going up. So I think that continuing resolutions are bad, but they are certainly preferred to what we've also seen in the past, which is government shutdowns. And the 2013 government shutdown happened in my second month on Capitol Hill. So that was a quick introduction to everything that was going on there, and how things really could fall apart quite quickly. It's interesting because, I think in the media, when the government shuts down, we hear a lot about furloughed workers, often minimum wage workers. The federal government is an enormous employer, losing their jobs, the economic uncertainty that comes with the government shutdown. And I think that's really important and crucial. And I think one of the biggest issues with Congress being so central to government shutdowns is that Congress has total discretion over how it handles a government shutdown. Each office can decide which of its staff are essential and which are not, and so who has to come to work. So some offices do furlough their staff and send them home. Other offices have their entire staff coming in and declare them essential. And I actually think this is a real problem because members of Congress don't always feel the pain of a government shutdown. Obviously, they know their constituents who are federal employees are hurting. They know their constituents who rely on a number of federal services that are deemed non-essential are hurting. But their day-to-day at work doesn't always change very much. And I really think it would increase the motivation to avoid and shutdowns more quickly if, their staff support also disappeared during this time. But alas, I do not run Congress, and I'm sure many of them would disagree that that's a good idea. But, for me, the government has shut down. I think it shut down 3 times, I want to say, while I worked in Congress, and I worked every day of those shutdowns. So, the only difference for me during the 2013 shutdown was that I had to work on Saturdays because they were doing votes on Saturdays. So, in terms of staff, the work really does continue, unless you're a junior staffer whose office decides to furlough you, in which case you hope they get back together before that paycheck is due.
So when Congress finally fixes a shutdown, or if by some miracle they pass the budget on time, I know that you mentioned there's kind of the appropriation season, but what's it like when the budget is finally complete?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. I think during my time in Congress, there was so many different shutdowns and continuing resolutions. It was sort of like, okay, on to the next thing. And one of the things about appropriation season is that it's so long that, even if you do a continuing resolution for a few months, you're basically running into the next appropriation season. And so it often will sneak up on you. So there's certainly not, in my experience, although I'm not an appropriation staffer, and I hope they went out and celebrated whenever they got their budgets done and passed. But, I think it's one of those things that sucks up so much of your time. And so you probably have now found time to work on other projects you've been neglecting for the last 3 months. But other than that, not a lot changes except for thinking about, the number you're putting after FY and all the things that you're writing. So, the next fiscal year is always around the corner.
Something that I've noticed is that oftentimes these discussions can have numbers that are so large or so abstract that it's hard to really tell the day-to-day impact that these discussions and negotiations can have. Do you feel like the work that happens on Capitol Hill is something where you can really see the tangible impacts of? And have you ever noticed a change in your life that has come from your work on the Hill?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really hard as a DC staffer to recognize all of that because, as Professor Dickinson explained in the first episode, the DC staff is primarily working on policy and the district or state staff is primarily working on constituent services and representation and things like that. And so, occasionally I would get an email from one of our caseworkers like, this wonderful thing happened to this woman. She hasn't had health insurance in 10 years and she just figured out she's newly eligible for Medicaid, thanks to the ACA, which there are certainly stories that you hear and there are letters that you get from constituents that you're like, oh yeah, I helped with that. But as a congressional staffer, you're part of such a giant organism. It's a little bit hard to feel like you're personally making an impact, which is one of the things that I struggled with. And it takes care and thoughtfulness to remind yourself that you are playing a role in this larger effort to help people. And that's truly why I think most people get into government service, is to help people. And so you don't always see it, and you don't always, read in the headlines that, what we're doing is helping people get their Social Security checks and helping people afford their medicines and things like that. But that it really is what you're doing. And so I really valued my time as a legislative correspondent, which is one of the staffers who primarily works on dealing with incoming mail and phone calls from constituents, because you get to see what people are thinking about and what people are hurting about and what people are grateful for. And it gives you a window into why we do the policy work that can sometimes admittedly feel distant from what's happening, but really does help people.
To kind of finish wrapping up the discussion, do you have any advice or tips for students who are interested in going into this field?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest thing for me in terms of finding my way on Capitol Hill was making sure people knew that I was interested in going to Capitol Hill. I just described it as this enormous organism, but it is limited in that, there are only 535 members of Congress. So there are only so many jobs and so many internship slots. So networking is a really important part of finding your way on Capitol Hill. So I would really encourage, current students or recent graduates who are interested to reach out to Middlebury alums who are either currently working on the Hill or formerly worked on the Hill through, Mid to Mid or other, alumni contacts. Folks at the Career Services Office, I'm sure, could direct you. Everybody who I've met who went to Middlebury who works on Capitol Hill is so friendly and so nice and really wants to help people navigate what can really seem like a black box if you don't know how it works, and to help you understand what the opportunities are and how you can take advantage of them. So I think, leveraging that Middlebury network is really important, as well as, just apply, try to get an internship. I think internships are really important in terms of getting job experience on the Hill. It's great to show, you've demonstrated interest by being an intern, and there's supposed to be money to fund congressional internships now. So take advantage of that, because that didn't exist while I was there. So yeah, I think, networking is tough and it's exhausting and it's even weirder in this COVID era. But really encourage you to reach out to those Middlebury folks you can find, myself included, to talk you through what it's like to work there and what the opportunities might be for you.
Thank you so much for having this discussion. It was super informative about something that can oftentimes be very abstract and complicated, and that advice is definitely helpful for students interested in this field.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Glad to do it.
And make sure to stay tuned for episode 3 of the MIDDVantage Career on Capitol Hill series, which will be coming out soon. Thank you.